The Tom Woods Show, episode 483.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey, everybody, if you're interested in more libertarian podcasts, let me recommend to you the Jason Stapleton program hosted by my friend Jason Stapleton. Monday through Friday, he gives you a libertarian look at the news. Check him out at jasonstapleton.com. Hey, everybody, Tom Woods here. We're talking about inequality today. This is a subject we have hit on a little bit in dribs and drabs, but never devoted a full episode to until today. And joining us to talk about it on all different levels, how much of it is there, what, if any, are the reasons we should be concerned about it, is Scott Winship, who is the Walter B. Wriston Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He holds a Ph.D. in social policy from Harvard University. On the show notes page for today, tomwoods.com/483, we will include a link to his archive of articles at Forbes.com. And it's my pleasure to welcome him to the show right now. Scott, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Tom.
I really have to thank you. You are doing my listeners a tremendous favor because, as I said before we went on, mastering this inequality literature is no small accomplishment. And having read a lot of your stuff, I can see that you know this study and what this one says and that one says, and correlation and causation and the whole gamut of issues that are raised you have written about. So rather than try to master that literature myself, I'm just going to cheat by inviting Scott Winship onto the show. Now, what you've done, one of the things you've done is looked at the issue of the consequences of inequality, because we see a lot of Facebook memes and President Obama statements that inequality is dragging down the economy, it's holding back growth. I want to get to that in a minute. Before we get to that, I want to talk about the extent of inequality and not whether it's good, bad, indifferent, but we hear a lot about this. There's been a tremendous increase in inequality, and I don't know if they're talking about income inequality or wealth inequality or what, but what is the actual trend, and is it as extreme as people let on?
Yeah, well, those are great questions to start off with. The problem with inequality is it's such a multifaceted topic that there are all sorts of little different avenues to explore. I think if we start with income inequality, I think it makes sense to look at trends in two different ways. To first look at income concentration, which is the extent to which incomes at the top have been getting bigger and bigger, and that's kind of what's getting all the attention here in the last decade or so. But then secondarily, you can think about income inequality within the 99%, if you want to use the Occupy Wall Street terms. And just very quickly, I think what's interesting that a lot of people don't realize is that income inequality below the top hasn't really grown all that much since the 1980s. So if you look at, for instance, the income of the typical middle-class household versus a typical poor household, that gap hasn't really risen since the late 80s. What has changed a lot is the extent of income concentration at the top. And so I think the best numbers here come from the Congressional Budget Office, actually, which show that in 1979, the top 1% of households earned something like 10% of all the income that was earned in that year. And then fast forward to 2007, on the cusp of the Great Recession, that number was more like 20%. And so, that's a real increase. In 1979, the top 1%'s average income was something like 9 times the average income for a middle-class household. In 2007, it was more like 22. So certainly a big increase over time. We can quibble about whether that's overstated a little bit, but I think very few people would argue that income concentration has not risen quite a bit over time.
All right. I guess what we have to get to now is what effects does this phenomenon have on the average person? Because the strong implication is that if some people are getting wealthier, this must be at the expense of everybody else.
That's certainly what you hear, I think, when you read about the topic in the news. And I spent several months a couple of years ago doing a pass through all the literature on this, because I sort of got tired of having arguments with people where no one was actually citing any literature. which typically is how these arguments go. And it was interesting. So I essentially looked at whether rising income inequality hurts the living standards of the poor and of the middle class, whether it affects economic growth, whether it affects financial stability. A lot of people think the financial crisis was caused by inequality, and whether it affects sort of democracy and political inequality. And kind of one by one, I showed in this piece that I wrote for National Affairs that either the evidence is really mixed, or it's just not that great, not good enough to really give us an answer one way or another. And essentially, there's the case that inequality has hurt any of these things is remarkably thin. If you actually confront anybody with studies on this stuff or challenge them to back up their assertions, there's just not a lot behind them.
What about instead of just inequality, we look at the issue of the actual well-being on an absolute level, not relative to anybody else, but the well-being of people, let's say in, I don't know, the first three, the bottom three of the 5 quintiles of the income distribution. What can we say about where they've gone from, let's say, the 1970s or so to today?
Great. So we're not 10 minutes in, and we got to quintiles, which I'm always excited about. So quintiles, for people who don't know, if you kind of think of the income distribution, lining everybody up from poorest to richest, quintiles essentially divide that up into fifths. So the middle quintile is kind of the middle class. The bottom quintile you can think of as the poor. And so if we look at the Congressional Budget Office data, which again I think is the best source out there, it has some figures that surprise a number of people. So for both the poor and the middle class, the Congressional Budget Office says that the average incomes for those groups have risen by something like 35, possibly all the way to 50% between 1979 and 2007, which I compare those 2 years because they were both peaks in the business cycle. Incomes took a hit, certainly in the Great Recession. But they're recovering, and so eventually we'll have another business cycle peak to compare 1979 to. But 35 to 50% translates into some roughly 10 grand. That's not an amount that any of us would be indifferent between having or not having today. Now critics will say, well, that's terribly slow growth on an annual basis, for instance. And well, it's hard to say without having some basis for comparison. So it is slower growth versus the 1950s and the 1960s, which were just this incredible period of income growth for everybody. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and reasons why we're never going to go back to that. It's also less than certainly what the income growth at the top was. But again, $10,000 is a pretty substantial amount of money. And I think another important thing to remember is that the conventional most used numbers that get cited on this question, which just come from sort of the Census Bureau dumps that they do in September actually every year, are not the best numbers for tracking living standards over time. There are a number of problems with how they adjust for the rise in the cost of living. They don't include certain sources of income. The Congressional Budget Office, I think, has done the most careful job, and it does show a surprising amount of growth for everyone, despite income inequality increasing.
There's a point, before I forget, there's a point in one of your articles on this that in trying to take on this claim that there's some kind of connection between the enrichment of the 1% and the impoverishment of everybody else, you seem to show, and again, you have to realize that correlation is not causation, but if I see a correlation that basically can't exist according to what my opponent claims, it does tend to undermine his argument.
Yep.
What is the actual relationship that at least we see correlation between the rising fortunes of the 1% and the fortunes of everybody else, and the declining fortunes of the 1% and the fortunes of everybody else?
Right. So I think what's interesting is over time, then the periods that are good for the top are also the periods that are the best for the middle class and for the bottom. So what's interesting about the slowdown in the growth in income for the middle class and for the poor is that it started in the 1970s, and that's important because income concentration didn't really start until the early to mid 1980s. So the slowdown in income growth really precedes the rise in income concentration by a decade. And the primary reason for that isn't a mystery. This happened in developed countries around the world where productivity slowed down, and it's remained below, for the most part, what it was in the 50s and 60s. So over time, the top 1%, their fortunes and the fortunes of the middle class and poor tend to move together. Now, I think what the left focuses on is that around 1980, a lot of different things do change in ways that do correlate with rising inequality. But what I tried to show in my article is that, exactly as you say, correlation certainly is not causation. For the most part, you could, and to be clear, I'm a supporter of immigration, particularly high-skilled immigration. But you can sort of, any argument that's made that correlates rising income concentration to problems that the middle class or poor are having, you could swap in the percentage of people in the United States who are immigrants and make the exact same argument. I would support neither of those arguments, but it just goes to show you can't simply say, well, inequality got worse over time and these other things got worse over time. And so it must be the case that inequality caused these other things to get worse over time.
Are you familiar with any of this so-called happiness literature that tries to, well, it does a lot of things, but one of the recent points they've tried to make is that inequality seems to lead to less happy societies, whereas the more equal the society is, the happier it is. Do you know anything about that?
I don't actually know that literature well. That's one of the few things I didn't take a look at in my article. There's another really important researcher named Lane Kenworthy, who is a sociologist and political scientist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, I believe. And Lane is a friend. He's a social democrat. His last book was actually called Social Democratic America. He would like to see us move more towards looking like Sweden. But he has looked at all of this in the same way that I have, and he generally tended to find the same results that I did. Essentially, the literature on happiness or on the health of individuals, whether physical or mental, which was another area I didn't look at, that essentially, the literature is very thin on this stuff. It's mixed, and so what tends to happen is people selectively, cite the study that makes the case they want to make, but the evidence really just isn't there when you dig into it.
I'm going to link on the show notes page today, tomwoods.com/483, to an episode I did quite a while ago on Denmark as supposedly the world's happiest country. I had a professor from a university in Denmark come on and say it's not for any of the reasons that the propagandists in the U.S. are telling you. It's social trust. It's not anything. It's not a minimum wage. It's not family policy. It's not medical leave. It's none of that stuff, because that over time, that forms the basis of your future expectations. You get used to it, so it can't be the cause of permanent increases in happiness. It becomes your baseline. It becomes your plateau for the future. So it can't. Okay, so anyway, so he was fantastic on that stuff. So I'm going to link to that. But I was curious about that because it seems like they're trying to come up with all kinds of reasons that even if what they would perceive as the justice reasons for going after inequality don't persuade us, then we have these other really urgent reasons to go after it. For instance, they'll say, in fact, you point this out in your article, that one of the claims is that the greater the inequality seems to correlate with financial crises and economic instability of various kinds. What does the evidence seem to show about that?
Well, this is a great case where there were kind of some claims made by pretty prominent folks, and then everyone just sort of cited them, and without really stopping to think about whether there was any there. So Robert Reich, I think, made the argument that the financial crisis was caused by rising inequality. One of the books on the financial crisis by Raghu Rajan made the same claim. He's now the head of India's central bank, I think. And there were a couple of academic papers that made this claim as well. What I cite in my article is a paper that came out after all of these claims, which directly took them on and essentially said, I'm able to replicate their findings, but when I do this in a more sophisticated way, what he essentially found is that financial crises are caused by bubbles, by credit bubbles, which is not anything that is shocking. And it's true that inequality, also income concentration, also tends to rise during those same periods. But it's really a consequence of the credit bubble. And so he's able to disentangle those in a way that no one else tried to do before, using data on crises going all the way back to the 19th century. So I think that really deflates the claims that these previous folks have made. The other thing that we haven't touched on that I've done a fair amount of work on is whether inequality hurts economic mobility. And this is another great area where, as you say, the correlations really make things kind of complicated. In the United States, turns out that economic mobility hasn't changed that much over, say, the last 50 years or so. Now, that's a problem if you think that inequality has hurt mobility, because mobility was no worse, is no worse now when inequality is high than it was several decades ago when inequality was much lower. Similarly, if you look across countries, there were pretty strong correlations between how much inequality a country had and how little mobility that it had. That's a correlation to start with, as we talked about. But also, I think even the correlation is kind of falling apart with new research that essentially is showing that the measure of mobility that was used in these analyses was not really a pure measure of mobility. It was kind of a measure of mobility. It was kind of a measure of inequality. And so, unsurprisingly, a measure that looks worse the more inequality increases tends to also correlate with measures of income inequality. The latest research shows that actually measured in a pure way, that mobility in the United States isn't any worse than in Canada, than in Sweden, which is pretty remarkable, and in Germany. And all of those countries have more inequality than the United States. So again, the correlation there isn't even obvious.
Scott, let's take a moment to thank our sponsor. Hey, everybody, I know you like listening to podcasts, and to libertarian ones in particular. Well, I'm very glad to recommend to you the Jason Stapleton program, hosted by my friend Jason Stapleton. He runs Monday through Friday as well at jasonstapleton.com, and he has a 10-episode challenge. So that's 2 weeks. If you'll listen for 2 weeks, you'll walk away better informed, more knowledgeable, and better equipped to challenge both progressives and conservatives. No more being silent when the subjects of politics or economics come up. You'll know how to articulate what you believe with confidence. Jason's goal is to teach the value of individual liberty and economic freedom through current events. And so for a full hour, 5 days a week, Jason will cover the current political and economic news from a libertarian perspective. Jason was recently picked up by the USA Radio Network, making him one of the only nationally syndicated libertarian radio show hosts in America. So check out the Jason Stapleton program at jasonstapleton.com. I want to read just a little passage from an article by Daniel Fernandez Mendez over at Mises.org on the subject of inequality around the world. And he's looking at the Gini coefficient, which is a metric that's used by some economists to try to track inequality. And he says, during the early 19th century, 35% of the global inequality found by the Gini index was due to differences across national borders. At the same time, 65% of the inequality was generated by differences in incomes within each country. But by the early 21st century, 85 to 90% of the inequality was due to differences across national borders, while only 10 to 15% of inequality was due to income differences within each country. In other words, the main source of inequality in the world has changed from the within-border inequality to cross-border inequality. And he goes on to say, this is clearly an indicator that inequality does not come from capitalism, but comes from the spread of industrialism and market institutions to different places at a different pace. If half the world embraces markets and the other half doesn't, it is clear that the development of the first group makes the world more unequal. But this fact doesn't tell us anything about the inequality in the areas adopting market institutions. Indeed, the available data supports precisely this hypothesis. Inequality across countries has risen from 15 Gini points to 60 to 63 Gini points, while within border inequality has fallen from 28 points to 7 to 11 points. That's a very interesting point, that at the very time that people are very concerned about inequality within countries, particularly the U.S., that has fallen in terms of the overall story of global inequality dramatically. The real story is countries that have sensible policies and countries that don't. Countries where people are at a subsistence level and countries where people are more prosperous.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I had done a study once where I attempted to look. The only time I've actually looked at countries outside the United States, where I tried to take on this claim that that's sort of, well, the United States, it turns out, has the same Gini as places like Nigeria, and so we ought to be indifferent essentially between living in these two countries because they have the same inequality levels. And took on the argument that more in countries with more inequality, that it hurt their economic growth. And it turns out that also does not look like it's true. There's no relationship between the two. In fact, in a lot of countries, particularly in the English-speaking world, countries that have more inequality actually have higher economic growth. So I think the political context is incredibly important in thinking about inequality. You can have inequality levels that are high, like in the United States, but where we have a democracy, where we have, to some extent, a meritocracy, or you can have high inequalities in sort of the developing world, where you really do have autocrats at the top who are stealing from their people. Obviously, those are two very different situations, and I think it amazes me sometimes that there are these papers that just look across countries and do correlations and don't make any attempt to distinguish between whether different types of high inequality might be better or worse for people.
Scott, one of the things I appreciate about your work is that you insert the appropriate level of nuance. You don't say everybody who disagrees with me is an idiot, or the evidence in every single case clearly falls in one direction, so everybody else must be a blockhead. Your work has the tone of a scholar who is genuinely looking through the data, wanting to see what kinds of conclusions it's pointing to, and I do appreciate that, and I'm going to link to a couple of your pieces at tomwoods.com/483. But having said that you appreciate nuance and you want to get everything just so, suppose you're in something like a presidential debate where you have 30 seconds to a minute, and somebody confronts you and says, inequality is a major issue in the United States today, and it's doing us tremendous harm. How would you try to summarize it in just that span of time?
Well, I think I would say that even as inequality has risen, the middle class and the poor have also increased their living standards, and that ultimately that's what really matters. If people are seeing gains themselves, they're not all that concerned with what's going on at the top. And that's why inequality consistently ranks pretty low down when people talk about their own political priorities. When the economy goes through recessions and does poorly, people get more anxious, and some people blame inequality for that. But no one cared about inequality in the 1990s when incomes were rising across the board.
Yeah, that is a good point, and a good one to end on. Scott, if people want to follow your work, I'm already going to link to your archive at Forbes, but is there another place I should send them?
Well, you can send them to our page at Economics 21, which is the research center at the Manhattan Institute that I'm affiliated with here in Washington, D.C. That's just economics21.org.
Okay, I'll do that. I've had Diana Furchtgut-Roth on in the past, too, a couple of times, and I've been happy to refer people over to Economics 21. So we'll certainly do that as well. Thanks so much for your time today. We all appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
All right, everybody. I want to make a correction to something I have apparently said a couple times this week regarding my upcoming events. I've been saying the wrong date. I was doing them from memory. I should never do that at my age. Doing them from memory, I was wrong on the date of my debate with Michael Malice. It's actually December 3rd, not December 4th in New York City. But the other dates are all correct. September 12th in Houston. This is all 2015 for anybody listening later on. Then September 16th in Granby, Colorado, and then October 3rd in the Dallas area in Texas. Those are the other events I have, but I'm sorry about the mix-up on the date. The Contra Krugman podcast is coming. It's going to be launching by the end of this month. It's going to be Bob Murphy and me, and we're going to be critiquing Paul Krugman's column every single week. We're going to refute that thing week after week after week on this weekly podcast. So stay tuned for that. I'll have a landing page up with more information very soon. We're going to have a YouTube video promoting it. It's going to be great, so stay tuned for that. I do have one other thing I want to tell you guys before we depart for the weekend, and that is I have been very fortunate these, I don't know how many episodes recently that I've had an audio engineer, Chris Williams, who has done just outstanding work for me. He has really helped me regain my sanity and free up some of my time to be able to do other things. For example, this free ebook on Bernie Sanders I have coming out, and all these guides I'm going to be producing to how to self-publish your book and how to do a podcast and how to blog and earn money and do all these sorts of things. I have the time because Chris Williams is doing a lot of this grunt work as an audio engineer for this show. He is experienced in all kinds of areas, and you really should check him out if you need any sound work of any kind done. You can find him at chriswilliamsaudio.com. chriswilliamsaudio.com. He is absolutely great. I hope you check that out. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.